Welcome back to Season 2 of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast, where we look forward to the new synthesis in the new millennium between faith, philosophy, and science. Welcome back to That's So Second Millennium, episode 69. This is the end of our interview with Father Lawrence Machia and Daniel Vanden Berk from St. Vincent College in Pennsylvania. So, after our discussion of their careers in the previous section of the interview, we went ahead and had this is going to be a fairly short episode, but this is a little discussion we had about, obviously, being scientists, in their case, astronomers, and, of course, astronomy and geology, and the difficulties, some of the faith and science issues, the places where these come up as a practical matter, the fact that most of these problems have solutions, but not everyone knows them or can trust them. There's, the sort of emotional difficulties that get in the way of faith, that masquerade as intellectual difficulties. I think you could sum a lot of it up that way. So it continues to be an interesting discussion. We're pleased to present the end of it. And next week we will move on to another interview.
Yeah, it's such a thing. Like we have this idea. You've probably read Galileos Daughter. Mm-hmm. That's such an excellent book.
That's great.
It's amazing book.
I think it's probably one of the better Galileo books. But
yeah.
How do I know there's?
Well, there's so many Galileo books. Some of them actually are good.
Yeah, that's right.
Some of them, but just that whole Galileo didn't see his life as this huge, contest against the Catholic Church. He was Catholic till the end of his life.
That's right.
Yeah. That's one of those things that unless you're inside it, you don't see. And it also sounds really, fortunate. We were just talking to Maureen Condick and, talking about just how hostile the environment in biology is toward people of faith, and especially toward Catholics. Whereas, in my background's in geology, where we're all we'll kind of just look at this. We can just look at the cliff face we're camping next to, like, this Earth that we're living on is much bigger than us, and it's been around so much longer than us. Maybe whether or not we agree on there being anything beyond it, at least we're united in realizing that's bigger than us.
Well, in the 19th century, geology was one of the big sort of faith science, conflicts or apparent.
Continues to be down to. Right. That was as a child, that was my difficulty. I started reading. My reading ability went ahead of my critical ability. In terms of, so I did see a conflict between science and religion because this book of Genesis here doesn't lay things out in exactly the same order as my pop-up book of the universe does. And that was when you're 8 years old, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Now I see ways around that. But, I sympathize for people who are really stuck there and people who come down on both sides of the divide in terms of, well, this Bible's just musty old book that people put together when they knew nothing. And we should just throw it out. Or the people who are, this Bible is too precious and we're going to, whatever you say that, contradicts this happening exactly this order and with whatever I'm unconsciously projecting into the narrative, which you can't help but do because it's so short. I'm just not going to, not going to, don't damage my faith with your stuff here. And I sympathize with that. I can't help with that. But yeah, that was the story. I was fortunate to have a sort of capstone class in undergrad where we actually talked about philosophy of science, which everyone needs to do and almost no one does in terms of a science education. And we talked about geology and the history. There was a book that I still have, I've reread a number of times since that class, called Great Geological Controversies. So it's all about, so the last one in the book is the KT extinction. The huge controversy about that in the 80s and 90s. But before that, the chapter before that is about plate tectonics, where within the lifetime of people who, were teaching when I was in school in the late 90s, oh yeah, everything we thought about how mountains were built and like almost everything else, actually kind of wrong. All of this data that we've been collecting over the centuries actually fits into this completely new paradigm. But that I bring that book up because it talks about the early 19th century when people were finally, having this debate about, okay, this Noah's flood, does it explain what we think it explains? And the evidence argued them out of there being this planet-wide flood. That doesn't look like these deposits here near the surface could be caused by that. Then, of course, you have to go back to the text and say, is that really the only way you can read that text?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole bunch of other questions we can't get into. But yeah, I mean, so for me, that's and it does depend on where you're coming from. If you're Richard Dawkins and all you see is evolutionary biology, and you're not going to worry about any of the logical things that had to make a world where evolutionary biology could even happen, I guess you can argue yourself into believing, well, evolution explains everything, and I don't need a God. But other disciplines, it doesn't work that way. If you're asking a slightly bigger question, whether it's the whole Earth even, let alone the whole universe, you need a little bit. And that, I think it shows in the way the sociology, the different disciplines toward religion. Or at least that's my supposition. I wanted to ask you both this question. What do you guys see as the significance of Catholic scientists for, well, and I phrase it, the past, present, and the future, but particularly the future of science? What role do those of us who are in the Society of Catholic Scientists, what do you see as the most important things we could be doing as scientists and as scientists of faith specifically?
Oh, well, just to be good witnesses as both scientists and Catholics. It's when I was an undergraduate, in order to fulfill my requirements for liberal arts education, we had to take some kind of history courses. I always took history of science courses, and I realized that historians of science have known for a very long time that the standard story of Galileo, for example, was that you hear on Cosmos and so forth was just was really not the way it really happened. It's much more complicated and far more interesting than what is usually presented. But nonetheless, the so-called this conflict thesis persists. Even though professionals in the field, Catholic or not, say, "Oh, that's not really what happened or what is happening." And I've heard it many times in my life. Friends who say, "How can you be a scientist and a believer at the same time?" And well, again, I've never really found a serious problem with it. It's not that there aren't challenges, but I always wonder, why do you think there's a problem? Mm-hmm. And there really hasn't been any. The answers are kind of wacky. They have to think about it for a while and don't really have an answer. But just to say that there's really nothing incompatible with them. You can easily be a scientist and a Catholic at the same time in whatever field, and not just astronomy, geology, but biology as well. And so it removes one of the excuses, I think, that people often use to say why they're not believers, right? But because the science thing comes up a lot. And this, it's just one less thing people can use as an excuse, I suppose.
Yeah, that's the hope. Yeah, to try to get that message out as far as we can. Yeah.
Do you find that happening among the students at St. Vincent's? How do they cope with the science-religion compatibility?
I think it's St. Vincent College. Everyone who goes there knows it's a Catholic college. If you're a student there, if your parents send your kids there, it's there's no apologies. It's a Catholic college, but but we're going to teach evolution and Big Bang and other things like that because it's fully consistent with the truth of the Catholic Church. And very seldom have I had any students who had a problem with any of that. And one way around that is also if there ever is a problem, to say, well, you don't have to believe in evolution or the Big Bang, but you do have to understand it so that, so if you want to talk about it intelligently, you have to understand what it's all about. But again, at least at St. Vincent is never, it's seldom a problem, I would say.
So the question, I think, as you initially phrased it, was something to the effect of the contribution of Catholic scientists to the future of science.
Yeah.
One of the things that John Paul II repeatedly said, St. John Paul II repeatedly said to the Pontifical Academy for the Sciences, various gatherings that they had, was that the right relationship between faith and science isn't where one pretends to do what the other is good at.
Right.
So we don't read the Bible looking for science.
Right.
That's what sort of makes up, causes a lot of these apparent conflicts.
Right.
How can you believe in the Bible when the science says, well, I don't read the Bible like that, because that's not what the Bible is trying to say.
Right. Right. Simply as a volume argument, if the Bible is written to be a science textbook, why does it spend thousands and thousands and thousands of pages not talking about science, and maybe a few dozen talking about things that might be construed as science?
In his letter to Christina of Lorraine, which is Galileo's one of his benefactors, he actually says explicitly that. He goes, "Listen, if the Bible meant to be a science book, particularly an astronomy book, and how come it mentions Orion one time,
right,
Venus once,
right?
We get mentioned of stars maybe a sprinkling of times, and it's you think if it intended to talk about these things, it would have actually talked about them, but it doesn't. It's not trying to say that, and that's okay.
Right.
So, the right relationship means understanding what each one is about.
Yeah.
Like faith, and by extension, philosophy, theology, metaphysics, those disciplines, academic disciplines, and also the interior life of faith they're very good at answering why questions. Spiritual questions, big questions, like you said, Dr. Vanden Berk, standing on top of the mountain in the middle of the desert. And it's hard not to ask those why questions. That would be a moment of contact between faith and science. You're appreciating the creation, and then it leads you into an act of worship. That's a moment of contact. They're different things. Science is concerned with the causes and the inherent within the physical nature of the world. So it's sort of restricted within that field, and it has its own methods, and that's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. So, beginning really with Galileo, and not just him, but a lot of his contemporaries, and moving on through history, it was a period of the church and the world kind of working out. How is this thing, this newfangled science, this empirical science, different in its methods from the former natural philosophy, from religion and faith and theology? We had to work that out, and so we've moved into that understanding as a church. And of course, that understanding was latent in our tradition from the beginning. It's just the circumstances came up. It's wow, well, we never thought about this before. Because no one was doing science like Galileo and his contemporaries were doing it before. So that's one thing. That you asked about the future of science, and I started talking about the past of science.
Well, I intended to ask, and I wrote it in my notes here to ask about all of them. And of course, the past. We say in geology, the past is the key to the present, and implicitly also the key to the future. It's what we have to work with. And, David Hume aside, it often works. It often seems to work pretty well.
Science is exceptionally good at what it does. So the first step there is recognizing, the competency of each field, theology versus empirical science. Different competencies, different methods, different source data. And that's the way it needs to be. But that doesn't mean that they're completely unrelated either. And so what St. John Paul II says is
sometimes that can be overstated.
The relationship that does exist is one of ethics. So actually, Dr. Vanden Berk and I were talking about this in the car on the way here. Like, what's the point of doing anything if you're not thinking about why you're doing it? So faith brings those questions to the fore. So in science, beginning with theoretical science, theoretical physics, quantum mechanics makes all sorts of wonderful technologies possible. Or hideous technologies. That's where ethics enters in. It directs, what do we choose to do with this power? John Paul II also links science with dominion over creation. The more you understand creation, the more essentially you have power over it. What do you do with that power? And how do you think about that power in context with our humanity? And so then you get into questions, well, what's our humanity? Who are we? And
what does that even,
exactly what this conference is about. What does it mean to be human?
That's what I was thinking, is we are feeding directly into why this conference is being convened on these very subjects. What do we do with all of that?
If you don't have that question down, or if you're not even asking that question, then God help us.
Right?
God help us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he will, fortunately.
Yeah, that's good.
Because we clearly need it.
He tends to be good at that. Yeah.
That is his MO. Oh, wow. Well, this has been a great conversation. We really appreciate you guys making the time and coming over and speaking to us. And I think it worked out just fine I hope you agree that it worked out just fine to talk to you together in the same room. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah. We look forward to are you talking tomorrow afternoon?
Tomorrow afternoon. Yes.
Afternoon. Yeah. Is it like 4:00 or something?
3:45.
3:45. Yeah.
I'll make sure I look at the time before the actual
afternoon. Yeah. I remember being at a workshop a while back where the guy with the last talk of the afternoon, like every five slides, he played the sound of an explosion just keep people awake.
That's a great idea.
You have tonight to work that into your slides and see if you can, or at least, get a noisemaker up there on stage.
I just make a noise
air
myself.
horn. Just saying. No, it'll be fascinating and it'll be very intriguing. So we look forward to that. All right. Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. This is great.
Thank you.
A lot of fun.
If you enjoyed this episode or one of our previous episodes, please leave us a review on iTunes. iTunes is the biggest distributor of podcasts, and having reviews there will help us reach a wider audience. We would also love it if you posted your review on other services like Google Play and Stitcher as well.